Hi, Sue Iannucci here from the Waterman Bird Club in Dutchess County, New York, here to talk to you today about gardening for wildlife. So, one of the main threats facing our birds today is habitat loss. And people aren't going away anytime soon, I don't think, so we need to find ways to coexist with our feathered friends. Today's focus will be on what we can do to make our living spaces more friendly for birds. And along the way, we'll learn about some of the birds we're likely to see if we're successful. Okay, so what do birds need? Well, birds and other wildlife need the same things we do: food, water, shelter, including cover to hide from weather and predators, as well as places to raise their young. And there's one more item we need to add to this list in order to better serve wildlife, and that is sustainable practices. So some of you might recognize this list. It comes from the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife program. It's their garden certification checklist. If you're interested, you can download the detailed checklist from their website and complete an online form to get your yard certified. I found this list to be a good starting point for thinking about what you want to do with your space, whether it's a yard, an empty corner lot, a community park, or just a deck or patio. So let's look in more detail at what birds need. Food. If you provide it, they will come. One of the easiest things you can do to attract birds to your yard is put up a bird feeder. Fill it with some black oil sunflower seeds, and you may see a northern cardinal in your yard. That's the female on the left and the male on the right. Finches are also seed eaters. The books will tell you that goldfinches are attracted to Niger or thistle seeds, but I have found that they are quite happy eating black oil sunflower seeds, which also happen to cost a lot less. I wouldn't recommend the seed mixes because the birds pick through it for their favorites and throw the rest on the ground. But if you want to try different kinds of seeds, then put them in separate feeders. I personally prefer these cage feeders over the tube feeders with individual perches, just because they accommodate more birds at once and they can be used by woodpeckers. This photo shows the American goldfinch in their winter plumage on the left and their summer breeding plumage on the right. The left is also what the females look like all year round. House finches are another common feeder bird. As you will see with many bird species, the male is often more colorful than the female. This is called sexual dimorphism. Another seed eater is the tufted tip mouse, and the inset in the right there shows a hopper style feeder. A few more seed eaters are mourning doves, blue jays, black-capped chickadees, and even little chipping sparrows. So note there is a responsibility that comes with feeding the birds, and that is to keep the feeding stations clean. Moldy or decomposing seeds in hulls can accumulate on feeder trays and make birds sick. And bird droppings may also spread infectious bird diseases. The most common one you might see is finch eye disease, where their eyes kind of swell shut. So you need to clean your feeders every couple of weeks with some soap and water or a mild bleach solution. If you use bleach, no more than 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. Rinse it thoroughly and let it dry before putting more seeds in it. And also, if you live in bear country, you will probably need to restrict your feeding to the months when bears are hibernating. So I would say just use common sense as to how often to clean your feeders. If you see a bird with eye disease, though, you need to take the feeders down and clean them and probably leave them down for a week or two until that bird clears out. In the spring, perhaps you'll see a rose-breasted grosbeak on your feeder. You can tell these birds are seed eaters. Just look at that big bill there, designed for cracking open seed shells. The birds like chickadees and tufted titmouse need to carry one seed to a branch and hold it between their toes and peck it open, whereas our cardinals, grosbeaks, and finches can do it all with just their beak and tongue, so they tend to just sit in the tray and continuously eat. This is an example of a tray feeder. This is my favorite just because you can actually see the whole bird. Chances are if something interesting comes to my hopper style feeder, it lands on the back side where I can't see it. And this photo also shows the male grosbeak on the left and the female on the right. So whatever type of feeder you put up, you're going to want to make sure it's not too close to any trees or tall shrubs. And you might want to get one of these large domes to put over it. The dome helps keeps the seeds dry during wet weather, and it prevents this from happening. That's what happened before I got the hood. On the ground underneath your feeder, you may find sparrows like this white-throated sparrow on the left or a dark-eyed junco on the right. These are winter residents in Dutchess County. And these birds are also adapting and learning to use the feeders just like other birds. I know when I started feeding birds years ago, the juncos were almost exclusively ground feeders, but today I'm just as likely to find them in the tray with the other birds. When the weather turns cold, add a block of suet to your feeding station, and you can attract woodpeckers like this downy woodpecker. You can tell this is a male by the little red spot on the back of his head. The female looks the same, but without the red. Or a red-bellied woodpecker or a white-breasted nuthatch. That's a female red-bellied woodpecker on the left. The male would have red that goes all the way over the forehead to the bill. The woodpeckers and nuthatches will also eat seeds, but they're particularly fond of the suet, as well as northern flickers who often come to eat suet. And as you can see in the lower right-hand photo, they will vigorously defend that block of suet from starlings. Now, if you want to get fancy, add some dried mealworms to the feeder tray, and the bluebirds will come. Bluebirds also eat suet and berries in the winter. They cannot crack open the sunflower seeds, but I have noticed them eating sunflower hearts if you put those out. The Carolina wrens also like the mealworms, as well as crushed peanuts, suet, and sunflower seeds. And if you want to help out our smallest feathered friends, the hummingbirds, especially in early spring and fall when there are not as many flowers in bloom, you can provide a sugar water feeder. Just 4 parts of water to 1 part sugar is all you need. You don't need the red food coloring. A lot of the hummingbird feeders are red to attract hummingbirds, because apparently hummingbirds have learned that other pollinators, mainly the insects, typically cannot see red or dark colors. And so the red flowers often have more nectar since there's not as many insects feeding on them. And there's another type of hummingbird feeder that I didn't show, which is a large red drum that you put bananas in. And this is supposed to generate fruit flies, which provide protein for the birds. But I also found that it attracts raccoons, which were quite adept at pulling it apart for the bananas. So once you start attracting small birds to your feeders, you will also attract larger birds interested in eating the smaller birds. These are accipiter hawks. On the left, we see a juvenile Cooper's hawk who's looking for sparrows in the garden. The little inset on the right shows what the adult plumage of a Cooper's hawk looks like. His head and back turn gray, and the barring on his chest becomes tan as opposed to the dark brown streaks of the young ones. And you will also attract other animals like chipmunks and red squirrels, who in turn attract other birds of prey, like this red-shouldered hawk. This bird of prey typically does not eat the other birds. I've noticed that when a Cooper's hawk arrives in the yard, you won't see a single bird. Or if the bird is at the feeder, like a woodpecker, he'll just freeze and not move. But when the red-shouldered hawk is in the yard, the other birds seem to go about their business and keep eating. So we've looked at a variety of birds that will eat what we feed them. And there are more, but this only adds up to maybe dozens of bird species. And there are roughly 250 species of birds that can be seen in Dutchess County throughout the year. So what do all the rest of them eat? And for that matter, what do our feeder birds eat when we're not feeding them? The answer to that is insects. Sure, some waterfowl and wading birds eat fish, amphibians, and invertebrates, but a whopping 96% of North American land birds depend on insects and spiders for themselves and especially for feeding their chicks. So this brings us to the gardening part of the talk. But first we need to review a little science and make sure we understand food chains. So here's Sue's version of a super simplified food chain. Plants are the first level in the food chain in any ecosystem. They're the only organisms capable of capturing the sun's energy and transforming it into food for the rest of us. The next level comprises all the animals that eat plants. Familiar herbivores like rabbits and deer play a rather small role when it comes to transferring energy from plants to the predators in the other levels of the food chain. It's really the insect herbivores who convert plant tissue into insect tissue and then excel at providing food in the form of themselves to other species. So the leaves on the plant are solar panels. They absorb the solar energy and convert it into chemical energy. The plant is eaten by caterpillars and insects, and the stored energy is transferred to the bugs. The birds eat the bugs, and the energy is transferred to the bird. So getting back to birds and their food requirements, insects are essential. Baby birds need insects for protein. Chickadee parents must find 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks that hatch, just to raise one brood to maturity. And that's a lot of bugs. And if you multiply that by all the other birds raising chicks, we're talking literally tons of bugs. Yes, I know this is not a chickadee. A chickadee is a cavity nester, which is difficult to photograph. So this photo is of a blue jay with some sort of winged insect that it's getting ready to feed to its chick. So how are you, as a gardener, going to help birds find insects? Plant native plants. If you only take away one thing from this talk, let it be this. The importance of native plants cannot be overemphasized. To understand why, we need to go into a little bit of science again. So why native plants? Most insects are specialists that only eat vegetation from plants they share an evolutionary history with. So to exploit host plants effectively, insects have evolved the ability to find the host, synchronize their life cycle with the host, and adapt to the leaf chemistry of the host. When faced with non-native ornamental plants, the insects either do not recognize the plant as a food source, or they find the leaf chemistry of the plant to be toxic to them. So by planting non-native pest-free ornamentals, we are starving the insects and subsequently the birds that depend on them. Alien ornamentals often introduce harmful diseases in insects that evolved on other continents. So the foreigners have no predators here and are able to outcompete our natives. This is partly how they become invasive. A classic example is chestnut blight, which came to North America from Asia. The American chestnut used to be the primary nut producer of eastern forests, far more than oak, hickory, and beech contribute today. And they hosted insects that supported huge populations of songbirds. Unfortunately, within 50 years, the dominant upland forest tree from Maine to Mississippi, with an 87 million year evolutionary history that included surviving an asteroid impact and at least 20 glaciations, was essentially eliminated from the eastern forest ecosystem. So by choosing native plants, we are gardening for insect diversity. So insects have a bad rap due to a few biting, stinging, disease-carrying, or crop-devouring types. But of the 4 million or so insect species, for comparison, there's roughly 10,000 species of birds, only 1% have a negative impact on humans. The other 99% pollinate plants, keep populations of other insects in check, aerate and enrich the soil, and provide food either directly or indirectly for most other animals. So in addition to chestnut blight, which eliminated the American chestnut tree, our native elm trees have been decimated by Dutch elm disease, which is an invasive fungus spread by elm bark beetles. And now we are witnessing the destruction of our ash trees due to the emerald ash borer. You can see evidence of this on the tree in the left picture. The bark is bleaching to that kind of pale salmon pink color. Non-native plant species are ticking time bombs. They take up space and crowd out our native species, directly killing them in some cases. So a few examples of invasive species running rampant in the Hudson Valley today include multiflora rose, shown in the upper right photo, taking over the edge of the forest there. Japanese barberry, which is a preferred habitat for the white-footed mouse, which we know spreads tick-borne diseases like Lyme. Garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, tree of heaven or ailanthus, which now we have learned is a preferred host to the spotted lanternfly, which we need to be on the lookout for. There's Phragmites and purple loosestrife in our wetlands, shown in the lower right photo, taking over our cattail marshes, and Oriental Bittersweet, just to name a few. Here's an example of Oriental Bittersweet that's literally choking an evergreen tree to death here. If we look at the photo on the upper right, it shows the destructive nature of the vine, how it wraps itself around whatever it finds and spirals up, kind of like a python choking the plant. This is not to be confused with our native grapevines, which do not spiral around their host and damage and constrict the growth, but which do provide a good food source for birds and other wildlife. And it's also not to be confused with American bittersweet, which is a native plant. If you want to know how to tell apart American bittersweet from the invasive Oriental bittersweet, you can look at the positioning of the berries on the branch. Native bittersweet berries only grow in a cluster at the end of the branch, whereas the Oriental bittersweet fruit is found all along the stem. And you can also look at the color of the capsules surrounding the ripening berries in the fall. The Oriental bittersweet is this bright yellow color, and the native American bittersweet would be a dark orange, almost the same color as the berry. So hopefully you're getting the idea that non-native invasive plants are bad and native plants are good. So if we want to plant for insect diversity, what should we plant? There's an excellent book on this subject by Doug Tallamy called Bringing Nature Home, if you would like to dive deeper into the relationships between insects and plants. It also contains lists of native plants with their wildlife value, as well as desirable landscaping attributes, organized by the region of the country. He also has a new book out called Nature's Best Hope, which is very good and has a lot of gardening tips also. So looking at a few of the examples from the book above here, we can see that all native plants are not equal when it comes to hosting insects. The numbers in this chart show the number of butterfly and moth species supported by each type of plant. So I don't know if you can read these, but it shows, for example, that an oak tree supports 534 different types of caterpillars. Willows, cherries, and plums, 456. Birch trees, 413. Blueberry and cranberry bushes, 288. Maple trees, 285. Pine, 203. Ash, 150. Beech, 126. And tulip trees, 28. So Uh, willows, cherries, plums, and birch support over 400 species, and a tulip tree only supports 28. So if you want to choose a plant to plant, take biodiversity into consideration. Why plant that tulip tree, which very few insects have the ability to eat, when you could plant an oak, willow, or cherry, which hosts hundreds of caterpillar species? So these are the keystone tree species that we talk about in the bird conservation lecture. And if you only have room for one tree in your yard, I would suggest you make it an oak. There's also a set of keystone species of non-woody plants, and these are mainly plants in the goldenrod, aster, and sunflower families. The National Wildlife Federation has a native plant finder that they developed with Dr. Tallamy, which allows you to search by zip code, and it will rank the plants based on the number of butterfly and moth species that use them as host plants for caterpillars. This is just a sample of their website, and I typed in my zip code. So the number one plant for hosting caterpillars for 12590 is the goldenrod. So in addition to having some keystone species, it's also important to plant a variety of plants that will bloom at different times of the year, so there's always something available for our insect and bird friends to eat. So try to plant some early blooming spring flowers like bloodroot or wild columbine. Then things like coreopsis or golden alexander and Jacob's ladder or prairie smoke will bloom later into the spring. And in summer, there's all sorts of choices. There's butterfly weeds, milkweeds, lobelia, cardinal flowers, Joe Pye weed, bee balm or monarda, and all the plants from the sunflower family. Come fall, flowers like goldenrod, asters, and sage will be blooming. And fall is also when a lot of the berries start to ripen on many shrubs. So check out the garden catalogs. Most of them will tell you the water and sun requirements, as well as when things typically are in bloom. And have fun seeing what you begin to attract. The National Audubon Society also has a website to help you find native plants to attract different kinds of birds to your yard. Similar to the Wildlife Federation plant finder, you enter your zip code and it comes back with lists of native plants that grow best in your area, along with a list of birds that are attracted to that type of plant. And they have different filters. I don't know if you can see, this is a screen capture of the website. You can filter the search by what type of plant you want, whether it's a shrub or a tree or a grass. You can also filter it by the type of resource you want, whether you're looking for fruit or nectar or something to attract butterflies. And you can even sort by the type of bird you want to attract to your yard. So check those out. They're very good sites. So getting back to bird food, if you plant it, they will come. Once you get some native plants established in your garden, along with the insects they host, there's a potential to see many more kinds of birds. Like this Baltimore Oriole. In the spring, I found these birds will come to a feeder if it contains fresh oranges. I've also heard that grape jelly works. There's speculation that they obtain their sweet tooth from wintering in the tropics where they eat a lot of fruit. So to feed an Oriole an orange, you just cut the orange in half and stick it on a nail or in a tray feeder. And the Oriole will plunge his beak into it and open it up, making a swath of juice, which then they can lap up with their brushy tongue. Another insect eater is this little blue-gray gnatcatcher. And you can tell the insect eaters from the seed eaters by these little beaks. Here's a great crested flycatcher. And then there are the warblers. This is a male yellow warbler. Here's a black-throated green warbler finding insects in the apple tree blossoms up at Peach Hill Park in Poughkeepsie. There's a few more warblers, the blue-winged warbler, the black and white warbler, a palm warbler, and a yellow-rumped warbler in its fall plumage. Note the leaves on the picture of this yellow-rumped warbler. See all the holes? That's a beautiful plant, which is part of a healthy ecosystem. It's clearly playing host to some sort of caterpillars, which in turn are providing food for the birds. So we could go on and on with warblers, but there's other beautiful birds too, like these cedar waxwings. So let's take a minute to talk about berries here. There's many invasive alien plants that produce a lot of edible berries for birds. Part of the reason they're so invasive is because the birds eat them and poop the seeds out elsewhere. The problem is that these berries only support the birds after they reproduce each season. They don't provide anything for the nestlings. So if having aliens means there are fewer insects available during the nesting season, then it doesn't matter how many berries are available in the fall, there won't be a new crop of birds to eat them. So it's better to provide berries and bugs by planting viburnum, winterberry, alternate leaf dogwood, or a red cedar, for example. And something else to consider is that all berries are not equal from a nutritional standpoint. The fall berries from our native plants are high in fat content, which gives the birds the energy they need for migration or to survive cold winters, whereas berries from many Asian Orientals are very high in sugar content. I guess that's like junk food for birds, maybe? So a few more examples of insect eaters. The upper left shows a tree swallow, which is mostly seen in open tree-less areas, but they got their name from nesting in tree cavities. However, they have taken nicely to nest boxes, which we'll discuss more in a little bit. The upper right shows a ruby-crowned kinglet foraging for insects in an American cranberry bush. The lower left is an eastern towhee, who's a large member of the sparrow family, though more colorful than many sparrows. They kick up the leaves in the underbrush, foraging for bugs. And the lower right shows a Swainson's thrush eating the berries of a native dogwood tree. So we spent a long time talking about food. Let's move on to some of the other things birds need: water, cover, and places to raise young. So if you're not fortunate enough to have a lake, stream, or pond on your property, then you will need to provide water in the form of bird baths, fountains, or even dog bowls. So here's an eastern baby bluebird checking out a typical ceramic bird bath. Probably the most popular water source in my backyard is these clay pot saucers. I put them in various places in the garden and on the deck, and they get lots of use. The birds, chipmunks, and squirrels all drink from them. The raccoons sometimes wash their food in them, leaving them full of mud in the morning. And the birds like to splash in them. One of my favorite signs of spring is when the catbirds return to my yard. They absolutely love the swimming pool. I see them in there every day, sometimes multiple times a day, splashing around. So I'm not really sure when they find the time to raise their young, because it seems they're always in the pool. And water is just as important for birds in winter, though you'll have to swap out the clay saucers for silicone or metal bowls, which won't crack when the water freezes at night. Another option is to get a heated bird bath like the one shown here. You can plug it into a temperature sensor so that it only heats the water when the temperature drops below freezing. And this shows a small flock of robins that came to drink on a wintry January day. There is a danger of birds bathing when the weather is extremely cold. I saw this once when a starling attempted to bathe in the heated bath on a sunny day when the temps were in the teens. When he got out, the water froze on his feathers and he couldn't shake the ice off. So then he'd get back in the bath to melt the ice, but when he got out, it instantly froze again. So I suspect that bird did not survive the night. Since then, I've read that Birdwatchers Digest magazine suggests you put rocks in the heated bird bath. So there's no room for bathing, but plenty of places still to drink from. Here's a few more images of birds enjoying the water. A mourning dove, an indigo bunting in the upper right, and a chickadee. And in the fledgling Cooper's hawk in the bottom right, didn't know what to make of the bird bath. They fledged out of their nest and they were in the trees watching all the other birds. I think it was just curious. So it got in and tried to splash by itself, but I think after trying it out, he decided that was really no big deal. Eventually, it did figure out how to take a drink, but that was the first and the last time I ever saw a raptor in my water dish. All right, moving on to shelter. Birds need cover as shelter from weather and predators. So here is one of the bird favorite bushes in my backyard, an American cranberry. You can see that even when most of the leaves have fallen, there's still a dense tangle of small branches and twigs, which provide excellent cover. The chickadees and other birds will take their seeds from the nearby feeder into this bush to peck on them. And if an alarm call goes out, the sparrows and finches all dive into this bush. I can be looking at it with my binoculars and only see a handful of birds. But if something startles them into flying, I'm always amazed at how many fly out, sometimes 20 or more. Here's another form of cover for birds, a brush pile. Pardon the bad pun, but this makes your yard cleanup a breeze after a windstorm. Just pile the downed branches here and save yourself a trip to the dump. I also dump the tray feeder here when I want to clean it, and the sparrows can peck through the remains looking for uneaten seeds. It's also a good place to dump the sunflower shells, as there's a toxin in the shells that seems to inhibit the growth of other plants if you get too many of them on the ground. The other solution to that is to buy sunflower hearts. A seed is roughly 40% hull, so a 50-pound bag of seeds is the equivalent of a 30-pound bag of hearts. The hearts cost a little bit more, but the advantage is not having to clean up all those shells around the feeders. And some birds who can't crack the shells, for example, the bluebirds, can eat the hearts. Here's a smaller brush pile. It started as a firewood pile, but morphed when I no longer had a fire pit and the wood began to rot. So there's a little white-throated sparrow in here that blends in quite well. Okay, birds also need safe nesting places to raise their young. And as the black birds on the right are saying, forget this do-it-yourself stuff next time we're using a contractor, as they see their friends in their cozy little birdhouse. This cartoon isn't totally accurate because, as we'll see, different kinds of birds build different kinds of nests. Some birds are cavity nesters. Primary cavity nesters, like woodpeckers and chickadees, excavate their own holes. So one way to help these birds is to leave dead snags on your property. A snag is just a dead tree. If you need to remove a tree for safety reasons, consider taking the top off, but leaving a good bit of the trunk for the birds. As it decays, it will provide both food and shelter. The secondary cavity nesters, like bluebirds, wrens, and swallows, will use the holes left over from the primary cavity nesters. I don't know how well it shows up in this photo, but the red-bellied woodpecker has made all sorts of holes in this dead willow trunk, and there's always birds nesting in there. Eastern screech owls are also cavity nesters. Here, a red morph and a gray morph appear to be hanging out together down in Croton Point. This particular cavity is in a large tree, maybe 15 to 20 feet off the ground. But as more and more land gets developed, there are fewer trees with suitable nesting cavities available. So we can help some of these birds, primarily the secondary cavity nesters, by providing nest boxes. Bluebird trails of nest boxes installed by the Waterman Bird Club are routinely cleaned and monitored. So this shows a typical bluebird box. Note the baffle below here to prevent predators from climbing up. Often you'll see two boxes side by side in open fields. It turns out that tree swallows like these nest boxes too. So by placing two boxes next to each other, a tree swallow will inhabit one and a bluebird is free to inhabit the other. The birds would not tolerate another pair of the same species in such close proximity, but they do not seem to mind the other species occupying the neighboring box, and then they help each other defend against intruders. So back in the early 1960s, when the club first began installing bluebird nest box trails, the birds were in decline in Dutchess County. Today, however, we fledge hundreds of bluebirds each year in nest boxes. So that's a real local conservation success story. The bluebird monitors count the eggs in the hatchlings, and they note when the birds fledge. Fledging means when they leave the nest. Then they clean the boxes so they're available for another brood. The bluebird chairperson has asked me to talk a little bit about the destructive nature of house sparrows, which are an invasive species here, and how given the opportunity, they will take over the nest box and kill the native birds. So if you're going to put up a nest box, she would urge you to monitor the box and eliminate the house sparrows if they move in. So birds who are not cavity nesters build nests of various shapes and sizes, typically hidden in the foliage where it's difficult to see them. They use grass, leaves, twigs, mud, or whatever they can find. This blue jay appears to have used some plastic cable ties. And this is where the native plants come in again, providing appropriate nesting sites along with a food source for the chicks. So this shows a blue jay nest in a viburnum bush. Here's a gray catbird hidden in a non-native forsythia bush on the side of my house. I think the lure of those swimming pools and the native plants in the backyard made it seem like a good idea to nest in this insect-barren bush, but I noticed that in subsequent years they did choose a different location. Ruby-throated hummingbirds make their nests out of lichen and spider webs. The female does all the work of building the nest, sitting on the eggs, and feeding the chicks. So she would probably welcome an easy meal at a sugar water feeder during this time. Robins are meticulous nest builders. The robin first makes the side walls of the nest with straw and then lines the bottom and sides with mud. The circles created as she moves around and around to make a flat bottom, and then another layer of straw is put down. At the other end of the spectrum, we have pigeons and mourning doves, who are not the best architects. They make a flimsy platform of twigs, often on man-made structures, such as gutters or ledges, or in this case, under the eaves of an abandoned hat factory down by Madame Brett Park in Beacon, New York. A Baltimore Oriole nest is a work of art. They weave this basket of grasses hanging from a tree branch. I would love to see how they actually start this process and how they manage to make that first strand take hold. This photo was taken on the Dutchess County Rail Trail up by the marsh just north of Route 55 last spring. Vireos typically make a cup-shaped nest, which hangs from a forked branch. I found this nest at Dennings Point over the winter, but I believe the bird that made it is this blue-headed vireo who I photographed there the preceding summer carrying food. And the trees are all leafed out, though the nest was very well hidden because this nest was just about at eye level, just off the trail, and I had no idea it was there. Cliff swallows and barn swallows build nests out of mud. These cliff swallows on the left have built under the eaves of a horse barn in the northern part of the county. The barn swallows on the right built their nest under a bridge over Wappingers Creek down by the New Hamburg train station. And I found last year during the COVID lockdown that the barn swallows were building their nests in the picnic pavilions over at Bodwin Park since there were no people there to disturb them. Bigger birds need bigger nests. This red-tailed hawk family refurbished a former great blue heron's nest down on Wappingers Creek. Note that the other heron nests in the rookery were still occupied by herons at the same time, so they must reach some sort of agreement during breeding season not to eat each other's chicks. If you're interested in learning more about nests, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has an excellent online resource at nestwatch.org. NestWatch is a citizen science project where you report the nests you find, but there's a wealth of information on everything from birdhouse construction plans to nest and egg identification help. There's also an interactive map of nest sites by species and year, as well as training on how to submit data to the NestWatch project. If you go to the Learn tab on their website, you can find out all sorts of things like why do shorebirds and ground nesting birds typically lay eggs which are rather pointy on one end? They're almost like teardrop shaped. And the answer is so their eggs don't roll off of a cliff or out of the nest. They'll just roll in a circle when they're that shape. Fall is a good time to look for bird nests because they're quite visible once all the leaves are gone. Unfortunately, the birds are gone too. But if you note where the nests are, chances are come spring, a bird will build in the near vicinity again if they were successful the previous year. So fall is also the time of year when I encourage people to take the Lazy Gardener Pledge. This is a campaign launched by Habitat Network, which is a citizen science project at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it encourages messy gardening. So messy gardening is a conservation project that benefits birds, pollinators, and other wildlife while asking you to do absolutely nothing. That's right, I said nothing. So by leaving your leaves on the ground, the dead flowers and weeds standing, and letting the grass grow tall and go to seed, you can provide valuable nourishment to migrating and overwintering birds. And you also provide nesting habitat for native bees and other pollinators, as well as a welcoming environment for all sorts of wildlife right up the food chain. So we'll go through the messy gardening tips. We've covered most of them already, but the last one is important. We want to leave the fallen leaves on the property over the winter and allow the dried flower heads to stay standing in the garden so birds like this chickadee can eat them through the winter. Let the grass grow tall and go to seed as well. Build brush piles instead of removing fallen branches. Leave snags, those dead trees on the property if you can. Don't use chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And here's the important one. Delay your garden cleanup in spring until after we've had several 50+ degree days in a row, as this allows the overwintering pollinators to wake up for the spring and move on. So messy gardening kind of leads us into the last topic that I wanted to cover, which is sustainable practices. Providing food, water, cover, and nest sites will create a wildlife-friendly garden, but how you manage your garden is important too. You want to maintain your landscape in a sustainable, environmentally friendly way to ensure that the water, soil, and air stay clean and healthy. All right, so sustainable practices involve soil and water conservation. We want to limit our water use and use drip or soaker hoses if possible. Collect rainwater, make a rain garden, reduce erosion, and use mulch. For those who don't know, a rain garden is a depression in a low-lying area filled with grasses and plants. And it's designed to filter stormwater runoff so that the stormwater goes back into the underground aquifer rather than out into the sewer and somewhere out of the watershed. We want to control exotic species. We know we want to use native plants, but we also want to remove those non-native invasives. And we want to reduce the amount of lawn, which is a virtual desert for most birds, and practice something called integrated pest management. So for pest management, you want to concentrate on prevention and natural pest controls as opposed to eradication. So please don't use rodenticides. They contain anticoagulants, which are harmful to non-targeted species as well. The mice eat from a bait box, but they don't die for another 5 to 7 days. And during this time, they are a walking poison package, eventually slowing down and becoming easy prey for a fox or an owl, who in turn becomes poisoned and dies a slow, painful death. And then the vultures come in and the poison keeps working its way right up the food chain. So instead, seal cracks in your foundation, remove climbing hedges from buildings, maintain your landscaping 2 feet away from structures, and encourage owls. At 3 mice per day, 1 owl could take care of over 1,000 mice per year. Or let the insects from native plants control other insect pests. The Natural Resources Defense Council has a documentary out called The Pollinators. I think it's available for streaming on all the services. And in it, they have some excellent examples of integrated pest management. One comes from a pumpkin farm. And the idea is that we need to change the way we do farming if we're going to help our pollinators. So first they plant a strip of flowers to attract bees so that the pollinators are already in the vicinity when the pumpkins are ready to be pollinated. And then they plant their pumpkins right in the field of rye, which is a cover crop, keeping the soil in place, which it also turns out eliminated the need to wash the mud off pumpkins in the fall when they were harvested. The pumpkins were clean. Now, a common pumpkin pest is the cucumber beetle, but it turns out this beetle prefers blue Hubbard squash to pumpkins if it can find it. So they planted a row of that squash right next to the pumpkins and found that even when the plants were very small, only a couple inches tall, the beetles were concentrated on the squash plants, decimating the leaves of the squash, while the pumpkin plants were untouched. So then the farmer was able to use a hand sprayer and target those 1 row of squash plants with all the harmful beetles in it, rather than having to spray insecticides over the whole field, killing everything, including our beneficial pollinators. So that's one kind of example of integrated pest management. And then there's organic practices. We want to eliminate the use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers. We want to compost and avoid plants grown with neonicotinoids. Neonics are neurotoxic insecticides that were designed to kill insects by attacking nerve cells. They're applied to the roots or as seed coatings, which the plant soaks up as it grows, and then it makes the whole plant, including its nectar, its pollen, and its fruit, toxic. And much of that chemical from those treated seeds, I think like 95% of it ends up in the soil. It ends up contaminating our water as well. So unfortunately, it kills not only the crop pests, but also the pollinator bees and butterflies and aquatic insects and invertebrates too. Even birds who eat one of these contaminated seeds can become disoriented and anorexic. And while we're on the subject of the gardening, there's another program I wanted to bring to your attention, which anyone can participate in. It's called the Pollinator Pathways program, and it's gaining a lot of traction in the Hudson Valley. It aims to help pollinators, which in turn will help the birds. Why? Because without pollinators, we cannot feed ourselves. 3/4 of the world's flowering plants and about 35% of the world's food crops depend on animal pollinators to reproduce. So basically, 1 of every 3 bites of food that we eat exists because of animals like bees, butterflies, moths, birds, bats, and beetles. So the mission of the Pathways program is to establish a continuous corridor of pollinator-friendly habitats and food sources by connecting properties that are no farther apart than 800 yards or so. 800 yards is the typical range of most native bees. So those messy gardening concepts we just talked about all apply to pollinators. In addition, it's important to leave some dead wood and a few patches of bare dirt available for nesting bees. And just keep in mind that most bees are solitary bees and will not sting you. So if we all chip in and plant a few native plants in our gardens or on our patios, we can help defragment their habitat so that these pollinator animals can spread across the country and continue to do their important work. There are many excellent resources also on gardening and pollinator plants, as well as invasive species and bee identification tools on the Pollinator Pathway website. They also have maps of the current pathways and information on how to get you or your town involved. So with over 95% of the lower 48 states land developed, this includes cities, infrastructure, industry, and agriculture, it's up to all of us to make a difference in the management of our nation's wildlife. Humans have changed the landscape drastically and rapidly on an evolutionary timescale, leaving the plants and animals no time to adapt to these sudden changes. So without our intervention now, many of them will not survive. Our gardens need native plants to support a diverse and balanced food web essential to any sustainable ecosystem. So support biodiversity and go native. Okay, I wanted to finish up with a video created by a friend of mine in the bird club. She doesn't put up bird feeders, but every year she enjoys watching a large variety of birds and other critters come to feast on the berries of her dogwood trees. So I think this is an excellent demonstration of the biodiversity that comes with native plants. So sit back and enjoy. These are native flowering dogwood trees. And there's our female cardinal, a Yellowrumped Warbler. That's a male scarlet tanager. Here's a little downy woodpecker. That one's an eastern kingbird. Here's our ruby-throated hummingbird doing its morning stretches. That's not a bird. Here's a chipping sparrow and a Baltimore Oriole. Looks like a red-eyed vireo and a European starling. That's the American robin. Looks like that one wasn't ripe yet. There you go. And that's our Swainson's thrush. It's a female housefinch and a northern flicker male. Uh-oh, chipmunk bird. And a northern mockingbird. Looks like a brown thrasher. And a gray catbird. That's also a tanager. It's a first-year male who isn't red yet. They're yellow when they start out. I think that's a tufted tip mouse. Oh yeah, there's Tufty. Pecking away. And I believe that's a Nashville warbler and a blue-headed vireo. Here's our eastern bluebird. All right, So thank you for joining me today. I've listed some of the resources that I used to create this talk. Feel free to take a screen capture of it if you'd like to go visit some of the websites and do some more research on your own. So thank you, and get out there and plant some native plants for biodiversity.